Amen. Dr. Barbara is here.
Yes, good afternoon, Barbara. All right, everyone, we're live.
So, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third and final day of the International Roundtable discussion on liberty. This discussion is hosted by the Center for Parliamentary Studies and Law Reforms of the National University of Advanced Legal Studies, Kochi, in association with Students for Liberty, South Asia. This being a 3-day seminar, we had discussed the political and social aspects of liberty in the previous days. Hence, the theme of today's discussion would cover the economic aspect of liberty through the topic, The Future of Freedom Through Conscious Capitalism, where we will be attempting to answer several questions which include, is the pursuit of happiness a means to achieve well-being economics? Are charter cities or special economic zones the way forward? What is the role of civil society under the free market principle in driven economy? What should the constitutional political economy be? Is market urbanism the solution to contemporary issues? My name is Ashwin Satish Nair, and I am a law student at NUALS and a local coordinator for Students for Liberty. And it is my pleasure to welcome the esteemed panel of speakers to our discussion today. Today, we have with us Dr. Barbara Kolm, who is the president of the Friedrich A. V. Hayek Institute in Vienna and is the director of the Austrian Economic Center. Being a worldwide networker, Dr. Quam uses these abilities to promote free market policies, in addition to being a frequent speaker on public policy-related issues like deregulation, competition, the future of Europe, and Austrian economics. Dr. Quam is the associate professor of Austrian economics at the University of Donja Grosia, Montenegro, and a member of the Board of Business Consultants of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber and a member of the Montpellier Society. She is also the president of the European Center for Economic Growth. Next, I'd also like to welcome Dr. Paul Frijters, who is a professor of Wellbeing Economics at the London School of Economics, where he specializes in happiness and health economics. He completed his Masters of Econometrics at the University of Groningen and his PhD at the University of Amsterdam. He has co-authored over 150 papers, 6 books, and is the top 1% of cited economists. Dr. Frijters is interested in all aspects of social science, but particularly well-being and public policy, and he serves as the advisor to UK government on how to implement well-being policies. Before joining LSE, he was based in Brisbane, where he was also named the Young Economist of the Year. Next, I'd like to welcome Ms. Bhuvana Anand, who is the Director of Research at Center for Civil Society, one of India's leading think tanks. Ms. Bhuvana's subjects of interest are public finance management, better regulation and governance, and political economy. She previously worked with the United Nations, the British government's Department for International Development, and most recently, MIT's Poverty Action Lab. She has a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy, specializing in development economics trade from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai University. Last but not the least, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's session, Dr. Vipin P. Veetil, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. Dr. Vipin was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Paris and has a PhD in economics from George Mason University, where he also has a certificate in computational social science. He has a master's in finance from Collegio Carlo Alberto in Italy, a master's in law and economics from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, University of Bologna, and University of A. Marseille. He did his BA honors in economics from Hindu College, University of Delhi, and has an international baccalaureate diploma from Shanghai American School in China. Once again, I welcome everyone to this event, and without further ado, I would like to hand over this session to our moderator, Dr. Vipin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ashwin. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so let me begin by thanking SFL for inviting me. It's also good to know that there's something advanced happening in Kochi. So, so good going, keep advancing. But when this session this is not the sort of topic I get to invited to speak on typically or moderate discussions thereof. I am typically invited to sort of comment on economic matters, specifically monetary matters. Nonetheless, I did do a little bit of homework today to get the discussion going. And I spent some time reading Buchanan, more specifically an essay of his called Afraid to be Free. There's a fair bit of what Buchanan says in the essay that I'm not sure I agree with, but he does tell us, he does say something which sort of resonated with me. And that something is the following. Buchanan says that that socialism, right, is by and large is been accepted to be flawed as an economic doctrine. Okay, so no one really believes that you can have a planned economy anymore. Of course, I'm not talking about the faculty lounges of universities in India, but I'm talking about sort of more practical people who do business and engage in day-to-day policy. That socialism is no longer sort of palatable or thought to be reasonable by a wide variety of people as an economic doctrine. But socialism still has a force of its own and a powerful force at that. As a psychological mechanism. More particularly, Buchanan says that socialism becomes the new parent in some senses. It has a parental role that, you know, when things go wrong in your life, it sort of, the state would step in to take care of you. And I think there is something to that. There is an emotional appeal, and it becomes even more pronounced as market economies become more dynamic. And that's sort of the paradox of it. As market economies become more dynamic, they tend to be associated with more flux across industries, right? So you'd see some firms collapsing, you'd see some industries collapsing. In the United States, for instance, there are 120 million workers. And every year there are about 120 million job changes. Okay, so of course there are professors at Stanford University who get tenure at 22 and stay there till they die in their offices, right? That's one group of people. But there are also people who change jobs every month. There are people who change jobs several times every year, right? And if you sum it all up, every year there are about 120 million job changes. There's a fair bit of flux in the economy. Every year, similarly, there are about 6 million firms, but every year about tens of thousands of new firms are born and tens of thousands of old firms die. And for some communities, this flux can be particularly difficult, right? So when entire industries collapse, think about the coal mining industry. When entire industries collapse, it can be particularly difficult for those communities to get out of that rut, so to speak, right? So as markets become more dynamic in some senses, socialism becomes even more appealing. And people are often implicitly or explicitly willing to pay the cost of lesser freedoms to do things, to have the parent state take care of them. Now, how well the state takes care of them, or empirically, whether they're more likely to benefit or are the costs worth paying, is a different question. Nonetheless, the psychological appeal, sort of, in some senses, can potentially grow with economic growth. Okay, at least there's no reason to expect the psychological appeal of having a parental state decline with economic growth. Okay, so one of the things that I was wondering if if our panelists could comment upon is this sort of psychological appeal of having a parental state, and how they see the future unfold from that point of view. My own impression is that, Buchanan in that article at some point says that, look, religion played this role for long, right? Religion played this role for long, especially as human society started growing bigger. You just couldn't see your parents being, your biological parents being powerful enough to take care of all the little troubles and big troubles that you'd encounter in the course of your life, because these troubles originate from well outside your family. So how can you sort of biological parents take care of that? And religion, in some senses, played an immensely important role in sort of substituting for the biological parents in some sense. And Buchanan quotes Nietzsche and says, suppose God is dead, who's going to play that role? And he says, state steps in to play that role. I think the question in front of freedom-loving people, in some sense, and libertarians, classical liberals, call them what you like, is not so much whether we can have this where we can have a society without a state at all. In some senses, the psychological function needs to be played. Religion, some of the more modern religions do play that function to some extent, but there are really only two options. One is extensive insurance markets, extensive private insurance markets. I think there's a good reason to push for insurance markets well before any other markets, right? Because they do take care of the fluctuations. Whether be, markets where farmers can sell their crops in future markets. Futures markets are in some sense insurance markets, right? Or health insurance markets, whatever they may be. But the other sort of more profound and perhaps sort of realistic, perhaps saddening, but I'm not sure it's saddening observation, is the fact that the real question is, what kind of a God can the state be? Right? The question is not so much whether the state can be a god or not, but what kind of a god? And you have various kinds of gods, right? So you can have gods that finance certain things, gods that put certain money into your pockets. There can also be gods that actually are very concerned with how you're likely to spend that money, which is a lot of what that MIT Poverty Action Lab people do, right? That, poor people have behavioral issues with how they spend. So we need to be far more involved as parents in taking care of these people, right? So I think that's where the discussion really is. What kind of a God do you want the state to be? And how big at what level should the God be, right? Should the God be, far away from you? Is it a God that you ought to be able to meet and talk to every now and then? I think those are the real sort of psychological questions here. And I think that's an area where economic theory is not going to help, right? Because these are profoundly deep psychological motifs, and no amount of evidence is going to help satisfy those callings. No amount of theorizing is going to help satisfy those callings, because they just don't appeal to the thin rational part of the human mind. So when we talk about freedom, I think it's important to go well beyond economic theory, to sort of get deep into the human psyche and understand the role of these different institutions as the economy grows, and as most of our life is spent countering and adapting to and responding to forces that originate well outside of the family and well outside of the community and most certainly well outside of ourselves. So with that sort of as my opening remark, perhaps let me begin by inviting Bhuvana to comment on what she sees as the role of the state in the future, and then we can have but let me begin with Bhuvana then. Yeah.
Thanks, Vipin. That was great. I really like that characterization, right? What sort of a God is the state going to be? And the second you said that, one immediate thought that came to my mind was the Hindu pantheon. And if you think about the sort of traditional practices, which is that every family has a local God, your Kuladeva, which is closest to you, that thinks about the things that are very material and very everyday in some sense. So, for example, the condition and well-being of your house, the condition of your family, the health of your family, many of those kinds of more localized constraints, right? How your village is operating around itself. And then, of course, you have this pantheon of hierarchy of gods, and each level had a very interesting role to play in your life. And in some ways, one way that I think about this is how do we adapt those principles, or is there something to learn from those principles in the way we have characterized sort of the modern state? I certainly will speak more about India because most of my experiences are here. One thought that that strikes me is how much the Indian state has taken over this kind of leveled duties of governments at different levels, right? And my sense is that has infantilized both communities and has, of course, sort of protracted some of the conflicts that should have been very easily resolved at the local level. So, for example, neighborhood conflicts, or for example, local living conflicts, right? Where the big federal government has stepped in, or the union government in our case has stepped in, and then sort of usurped some of those roles, which have meant that this kind of gradation, what we would think of as subsidiarity, has completely been eroded. Right? So when I think about the modern state, at least in the context of India, the first thought that occurs to me is that it needs to be the all-pervasive state, the way it is at the moment. It needs to change that towards more selective application of its coercive powers. So that's one big thought that I have. The second is, I think you're right in that something has the level of complexity in our lives has certainly meant that I don't see the state going away, and nor do I think that it needs to go away. My way of thinking about it is that it does need to retreat but it also needs to think a little bit harder about the complexity and emergent phenomena, right? So, for example, what does it mean for us to be able to share all this vast amounts of information about each other freely without sometimes thinking about the sort of perils and challenges of data and privacy, right? There's something that the role is that the state is able to do. So my overall thinking is that there is some amount of retreat that is required. Well, let me rephrase. A large amount of retreat that is required, particularly from spheres of localized issues, and perhaps a reorientation towards exactly what you're saying, more complex, more higher level questions, if you will. Buchanan also says something really interesting, right? He says that democracy is government by discussion. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently, is that in the size of the states that we have created, is discussion even feasible? And I don't mean just sort of slurring and throwing insults at each other, but being able to genuinely communicate and engage in discursive conversation around powers, responsibilities, coercion, so on and so forth. And is that even possible at the scale of the states that we have established? My sense is not. And if we sort of want to think about that kind of process, we've got to reorient the state. I'll stop there.
All right, so perhaps we can have opening remarks like Bhuvana's own, and then we can have a discussion, Bhuvana, like you pointed out. They can be useful sometimes. Huh? Okay, Paul, would you like to give us your opening remarks on the matter at hand? Paul?
Are you talking about me?
Yes, I am. Welcome.
Okay. Okay. Welcome everybody from London. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to sort of hear all these thoughts about how to think about the state, private actors, and what sort of direction we should push the state towards and we should push private actors towards. I often like to think about these kind of things in the context of a major policy or a major issue, because otherwise it gets to be too much, an esoterical religious debate whereby we all pretend to steer the world, but really there's no steering wheel, and so we're all pretending to steer something. Like we are fleas on the back of the elephant, pretending that we know where it is going and that we can direct it towards. So I would want to discuss this in the context of the reactions we've had to the coronavirus pandemic. Whereby we've seen in the West and in India tremendous expansion of the role of the state in many areas where it is tremendously unsuitable for. And it didn't do this as a power grab, certainly not in Europe, but because populations were scared and demanded this. They demanded the government take over most of the economy and get involved very much in terms of social functioning, whom people could meet, where they could travel, how they could relate to each other. And I think from any objective point of view, this has been a total disaster, right? The losses and damage done by all this sort of government forced action has been magnitudes greater than whatever the virus could have done. So people in their fear for the virus have inflicted via the government a pain upon themselves that is far, far greater than, as it were, the threat that they were fleeing from. And I think that this is very clear in India, where the death toll due to corona is very, very small. But of course, you are now also facing an economic collapse. You're going to have masses of high unemployment, reduced government services in the future as the government has burnt money over this. But of course, also a tremendous decrease in business activity, which was sort of lifting India in a long-run sense out of its slums. And still, this is extremely popular amongst the friends I have in India and amongst the poor I know in India. So it's kind of like grand mass stupidity that we've done to each other. And this was predictable if you had a lot of well-being knowledge, because we knew that, forced social isolation causes a lot of loneliness, causes a lot of misery, a lot of suicide down the line. And as economists, we know that preventing businesses means economic collapse that will only recover quite slowly. And that down the line, that'll cost many more lives. So it was a predictable collapse, and it was predicted. I was involved in that in March already, and so were others. And so that sort of brings the question, well, okay, if that was such a stupid thing, how are we going to learn from this? How are we going to ensure this doesn't happen again, and what direction should we push the state and businesses towards? And there are several things to say. One is that business has been missing in action. This is true in Europe, but also true in India. They should have been arguing against this. They should now be lobbying on television and media against this vociferously, building up an alternative expertise base, but they've not. And they've not because they're afraid of the populations who are sort of all in favor of this quite idiotic program, which is still raging in Europe and even worse in India. So business has sort of dropped the ball, and it's not clear that they will start to get engaged, but they should. But I think also in the state, there are questions that maybe we can make some progress on. So the UK, which has sort of had a horrible experience, I think should have a conversation as to how it relates to specialist medical advice, the role of medical institutions, which have seriously dropped the ball, and also the notion of what to do in order to tap into more centers of knowledge, because as it were, a small quasi-religious group has sort of grabbed the policy-making agenda and has sort of enforced a very narrow view of what health and safety is on the rest of the population, really at the expense of health of the whole of the population. And institutional reform there around the NHS, medical advice giving towards the world should be possible. And of course, there is now also the question of, okay, how are we going to push back government control of the economy, which has sort of been horrible, which has led to mass unemployment, lots of businesses. How is that balance going to be redressed? And I think the reality is just that, we're going to have a period of mass unemployment, and that, business will have to regrow, and governments will basically have to retreat from the economy, probably in a big bang element in the coming months. I think I'll leave it at that. I think that's enough of my time.
I have sort of several questions to ask you, Paul, but let me actually request Barbara to sort of make her opening remarks, and then we can get to discussion. Thank you, Paul. Professor Barbara Kolm.
Okay, now you should hear me. Hello. Apologies, I had a difficult agenda today, and I'm traveling, as you can see from the background. So if my internet breaks down, apologies again. I'm not in Austria, where infrastructure is working very well. So please, apologies in advance. Coming back to your big topic, and how we should actually discuss the big role of government and well-being in economics. What does it mean? How do we achieve the ends? I would also like, as Paul started out, looking at what has changed in times of COVID or due to COVID. And I think the role of government is coming back again by trying to solve individuals' problems and trying to make up what they had not done, because there were no pandemic plans in place, neither in Europe nor in many other countries in the world. So definitely there was something that government did not think about, but individuals have to suffer. This is one point. Second thing, where do we stand? Do we have the idea of big government in terms of not only providing the rule of law, but providing all services to the individuals and not allowing them to take their own decisions? And this is what has changed in the past decades. When we look back at, for example, when the freedom movement, when the pro-market people, when the libertarian movement started out after the wars in Europe, the Montpellier Society was founded because scientists and individuals like Hayek, but also Ludwig Erhard and others were afraid that central planning was becoming big again. And those guys thought, well, we do not want those centrally planned economies. We want economies that can react to the subsidiarity principle, where individuals can take their own choices, and where governments also provide the best, where governments compete with each other and where best solutions are provided. This has changed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, after the big economic well-being had happened, and economic growth has done a lot of positive things for our societies. Now looking back, that everybody has achieved a certain level of not only wellness but of wealth. People thought, well, so let's take a step back. Let's take a step back from our own responsibility, but divide responsibility to governments, or actually not divide, but give it back to the governments, and governments should take care of it. So, because we were probably also too lazy, because we thought it would go on, and it's not our own achievement. We need to achieve. We must not forget that it's us who provide the services, who provide the good ideas, the creativity, the looking forward. So having said that, I would like to deeply dive at least for some minutes into the pursuit of happiness and well-being economics. And since Paul is in London, and we have a couple of very well-known think tanks in London who have been working on those topics, I would just like to quote a couple of things. So the idea was put forward by the British government that economics and politicians pursue policies directed towards the maximizing of GDP is a straw man. Government has always had a multitude of different objectives, and government policies would be very different today if economic growth were just the single priority. So explicit attempts by governments to control GDP or actually rapidly increase GDP growth have normally failed. Such a target-driven mentality is part of the conceit of central planning. Attempts to certainly direct policy towards improving general well-being will and has actually always failed. So in contrary to popular perception, new statistical work suggests that happiness is related to income, and income especially provided by oneself, achieved by oneself, and not by handouts that were given from somebody else. So the relationship that holds between countries, within countries, and over time. The relationship is robust and also holds higher levels of income as well as lower levels of income in itself. So in other words, people with lower income can equally be happy and can achieve the pursuit of happiness, whereas people with higher income probably cannot and must. So you cannot compare those two. And having said that, there is data showing in a set of 26 countries, show that the correlation between life satisfaction and the long permanent income within given countries lies between 0.3 and 0.5. So there is a similar correlation between growth in life satisfaction and growth in income. And I would say I'd leave it at that. I think I gave you a couple of ideas where we can work on or discuss on. And my question, since I could not come in at the very beginning, Vipin, would be, will we also discuss the role of civil society and market urbanism as originally discussed, or shall we stick just to the point of the pursuit of happiness and well-being economics?
Whatever you want, Barbara.
Okay.
We just go with the flow,
Okay. Because if I may speak right now, I probably would continue, because the point is if I'm driving in the countryside and I don't know when my net is breaking down, so I just take advantage. Please don't think I'm overdoing that. Okay, so we were talking about the correlation between happiness and equality, which is also probably important because there is no evidence that equality is related to happiness. And this is what we always have to keep in mind when state and where governments can feed into with their tasks. And again, I'm a true believer that the rule of law is the top priority that governments should provide. And then you can always look into what governments can provide in terms of services to the citizens. It depends on the how well a country or a nation is developed. I think I would leave it at that right now and open the floor for discussions for everybody.
Yeah, interestingly, so actually a fair bit of that article, Buchanan's article, Afraid to be Free, is actually about people wanting big government. And he says, you don't get big government only because of the public choice kind of reasons. Lots of people actually want, and the recent COVID experience kind of tells that story a little bit. But what I was wondering, Paul, would you know why that has happened right now? Why? So there's one place where businesses have fought back a little bit is the US. So Elon Musk has, been like, arrest me, I'm working, right? Recently, there have been a couple of gym owners, I mean, two blokes who had a gym. They said, look, we're going to open our gym, and the mayor actually got a court order to close it. So they put the police went and they put a lock on the gym. So these guys just bolted out the door, and they said, arrest us. They're not being violent. In fact, they've opened up their property for anyone to use 24/7, even without subscription. But they're just not willing to sort of close businesses without there being sufficient evidence that this government action is leading to more good than bad, or any evidence for that matter. So why do you think that we haven't seen that response at a larger scale, and we haven't seen that nearly? I don't know, Bhuvana. I mean, if I'm not wrong, we haven't seen that much in India at all.
We've seen a different kind of response though, right? So if you remember the early days of the lockdown, very quickly, I think within about 2 weeks, folks were like, no, I'm not able to pay my bills. And you had thousands, millions of immigrants come out and say nothing doing. I'm going back, right? So in one way, it was a form of civil protest. It was not backed by the same kinds of reasons, but they had no... they had plenty of reason to fear the state would come down on them pretty hard, right? But they still showed up at bus stands and train stations and started walking and said, we don't know how long or what you're going to do with this. So in some form, we've seen that type of action.
But, to kind of add sort of to the question a little bit, and then, perhaps Barbara and Paul can both respond to that. But Paul, we've done, when the sort of state action began, we organized, Center for Civil Society along with Students for Liberty organized a 3-day online seminar about the cost of government intervention. I myself have spoken at 2-3 Students for Liberty events where we've said that the flattening of the curve story, right? That you can't take the horizontal line as a given because the supply of medical services fluctuates with demand, especially if you let prices fluctuate with demand. You can't take the inverted bell-shaped virus curve as a given because markets respond to these things. We had a company called Big Basket here, which was beginning to give this thing called no-touch delivery. But Big Basket was not allowed to operate for several weeks. But these ideas don't really appear in the. Not just in mainstream media is one way, but here when I see mainstream media, I mean pretty much vast majority of Indian media. It's just not there. It's entirely absent. What's gone wrong, Paul?
Okay, Vipin, we're touching on many different things here, right? As you said, business is fighting back a little bit. I've been involved in this in Belgium and in Australia and a little bit in the UK and Sweden as well. And indeed, if there's any interest group that is trying to fight back, it is business. They are organizing, petitions and this and that but they're not organizing professionally. They're not running concerted media campaigns in the European media. They're not buying up advertising space. They're not bringing out alternative expert reports, really challenging, as it were, the medical mafia that has now emerged. And I think that, and they're afraid because the population is so overwhelmingly in favor of it. I mean, the numbers I keep seeing suggest that almost everywhere, 80% of the population, including the poor, is totally in favor of the harshest measures one can think of. They like to sacrifice their liberty, but also the future of their own children. They have no problems with the kind of apartheid system towards their own elders, the collapse of their own social and economic life. It is almost like watching a pagan ritual whereby for some sort of imagined very small risk that they are prepared to sort of, kill off large parts of their own community in a sacrificial event. And I think to understand that, we must think of individuals and of society as very different than populated by rational individuals. One doesn't get very far with that. The risks of this COVID are so small, and the collapse of the economic and social system is so obvious that you just can't keep saying stuff like that. That's clearly not what humans are like. Humans are very, very different types of animals than this kind of rational atomic person. So, I mean, I see this as a mass phenomenon. I see this as a crowd phenomenon. I see this as similar to waves of nationalism. Also, like Hindu nationalism has been a crowd phenomenon in India in recent years. So you can reflect on it in terms of your own experiences. It should be understood like that. It should be understood like almost an outbreak of religiosity, of wanting to sacrifice, wanting to be a crowd in a community, quite willing to sacrifice all kinds of things which are far more bigger than what might be gained via the virus. And not really because of the virus, but because people like to be part of a crowd. They like to feel that notion that they're part of something much bigger than themselves. And I have tried to write about that. But really, this is an area in which sociologists used to write a century ago because they were motivated by the Nazi experience, which they very much saw as a crowd event. They were motivated by the end of the 19th century, all these waves of nationalism that you saw, also the advent of communism. That was another, sort of real crowd element that happened in many countries, but the memory of that has faded. And in that sense, the Mont Pelerin Society's view of life is basically this atomistic rational individuals. It negates this kind of group herd mentality that people truly have. And in that sense, I'd like to comment on one thing that Barbara said, which I think is a total mistake in terms of thinking about society, which is that what mistakes libertarians shouldn't go into is thinking that most of the people who are rich and successful are individual entrepreneurs who by their own wits make it. No, the vast majority of people who are rich and successful are system people. They are CEOs of large corporations. They've made it not on their own, but by networking inside these corporations to get to the top of it. They are bureaucrats. They are almost the antithesis of real entrepreneurialism. And so the myth of, the rational entrepreneur is not helping libertarians because you then hand over power to people who are just as stately, as it were, as government itself. Corporations and the state are really very, very similar things. And so the leadership of corporations are very similar to the leadership of state. You're not really going towards liberty. So I think there also has to be a reimagining of what liberty is in that kind of highly corporate setting. It is not the notion that corporations represent freedom and liberty. No, they're not. They're the opposite, right? But that's another discussion to be had. I think we should leave time for others.
If I may come in on that and add on to what Paul said, and I think it's very important that we look back at restoring our civil society and what civil society really it's the self-responsibility and taking care of our own. And what is the nucleus of that? It's the individual, it's the family, and it's not the state, it's not the government. It's a small group that is surrounded, that we are surrounded with, and where we can take as individuals, because it's so important to keep the individual freedom up. So in order to keep that, we need to say no to certain, things that shrink our personal responsibilities, and where governments just simply want to, or government sneaks in. And we have accepted that in many ways because it was kind of very comfortable to delegate responsibility. And we should rather say no to those things and not accept the limitation of our individual freedom, and look back of what makes what makes a society. How is a society made up? It's made up by many individuals who form a family or a group or whatever, and those should also be able to take the decisions. And be self-responsible is something very important that we need to keep in mind, especially also given what COVID has shown, and what was happening during the couple of months, when our individual freedom was totally, sorry, I don't know if you heard the last sentence, but or post-war Europe, when General Clay and Ludwig Erhard decided to let the markets work, we should also, in every sense, allow markets to work, given that within the rule of law, government enterprises and businesses operate. And that should be our foremost task. Oh.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, Barbara, we can hear you.
This is Bhuvana.
Okay, yeah, Bhuvana.
Sorry, just very quickly, a couple of thoughts and examples that came to mind from India, right?
Yeah.
The idea of why aren't enterprises standing up more strongly? I think one sort of difference between, and this goes back to the earlier point I raised, is that who would you protest to? It's very hard for a small firm, a localized firm, to protest to this big central government, right? It's very hard for one business to be able to make its voice heard. And I think that that's part of the, sort of directional change that's non-negotiable for us. Were the kind of lockdown, sort of more localized, to say state level or even municipal level, with that true kind of competition, perhaps we would have seen a lot more of this. What we've also seen, I think this is not peculiar to India, but in a few different countries, is that COVID has happened at the sort of at a continuum of the rise of nationalism, right? So this fervor also of doing something for the country, and a number of governments have, or at least a number of leaders have come up on that plank. We see it very sharply here. So the idea of lockdown, the rhetoric behind lockdown was all about sacrifice, was all about national interest, was all about, the higher purpose and so on and so forth, which is not an aberration. And the reason it worked is simply because it has come 6 years into sort of the same kind of messaging that is being amped up, right? So that's a sort of second thought that was on my mind. A third thing that I wanted to point out is, one way to think about protest is to say that, were we carrying out a vociferous public campaign protesting? The other way to think about it is how was civil society sort of engaging in subversive action, right? And you were talking about Big Basket. But
I like that, subversive action.
Well, it is, right? So if you think about medicines in India, e-pharmacies today, since 2014 really, have existed in this wonderful regulatory sort of vacuum. They're all run as e-commerce firms. In fact, Amazon, I think just yesterday started delivering medicines. And they're treated as e-commerce firms. And the way they figured out that they're going to work this out is because everything related to running a pharmacy is about a brick and mortar shop. So they just simply turn around and say, well, we're not breaking the rules, but we are going to subvert the way the rules work, right? Or for that matter, what Zomato did. And then you also see this enormous amount of innovation. And we're currently writing a paper just simply tracking the ways in which the food delivery industry managed to be one of the few industries that has kept running, not at scale, but still kept going in this time of deep lockdown. right? So just to think or expand the ways we think about protest, I think is helpful. And the last point sort of that I want to make on the question of civil society is, I think, yes, there is one part of it is how much civil society is ceding space to the state and what is the role for it. But the other is also for the government to, or for us to really demand some retreat from the government, at least in the case of India, right? Again, with COVID, a simple thing, the Prime Minister's CARES fund came up and resulted in an enormous amount of cannibalization of what would have been private, sort of localized, context-specific, perhaps, sort of far more relevant, faster type of aid, right? And this is something that's been a claw in my side for a long time. It follows from the corporate social responsibility rules, right? Where corporates had to sign away 2% of profits. And funnily, no corporate protests this. This, I think, is a true failure, right? Is for you to say that, listen, because we will earn brownie points with the government, we will go ahead and say, great, 2% is, this is great. We're doing so much CSR. It's a terrible idea. We should never have, and that was the time to, 2013 was the time to protest and stop it. 2020, it's a tad late because it's several things have happened since, and there's a bit of a momentum building. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Can I react on that?
Yeah, please, Paul.
Yes, because I've long been interested in the Indian economy and the way it's grown, and I agree with the sentiment that Bhuvana just expressed, which is that the state government, particularly the federal government in Delhi, is really part of the problem when it comes to economic growth, and that it's now taxing a lot of the sort of innovative sectors such that it's sort of strangling them, and that's terrible for India. I mean, GDP really needs to be the big focus, and it's been a big success, and now it's been, strangled, and COVID has allowed that to happen, right? COVID has given, empowered, as it were, the state government to grab more control, and hence, basically move against private sector. In all its way, both small and large, and that's a disaster for India. That's really, really bad. But I've always been optimistic for the long run of India, even though I've seen the poverty in this and that. And I want to tell you why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic in India because there's a type-out theorem happening in India, and there has been for the last 30 years, which is that, yes, there's tremendous corruption at all levels, but it's corruption that competes with itself. So all these little cities and the big cities and the regions and the individual states, they all compete for sort of, growing businesses. And they don't want to strangle economic growth within their own little neck of the woods for fear that somebody else who's growing will then take them over, or that the best companies will then move somewhere else. And that is a very stable system. So I think in a strange way, the chaos, the tremendous corruption, the endemic diversity of India is its best guarantee for its long run growth. And in that sense, I see COVID a little bit as an aberration, temporary, allowing too much control at the center, but that'll whittle away. Basically, the individual states, the individual cities have got to push back. And that's where I also think the pushback will come from. The pushback won't come from small companies, or maybe not even large. It'll come from within the political system, that all this competition internally will start to reemerge again, as individual cities want to be richer. So I'm not pessimistic about the long run of India, but I do see what is happening now as a disaster for the well-being of Indians in these years.
Oh, that's a fabulous. Please, Barbara, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. May I just also come in, because competition, after all, has saved us across the world, has elevated ourselves, has brought in innovation and all this wonderful processes that have created wealth. So if we don't lock out competitive processes and allow our societies to compete with each other, I think there will be a positive outcome for the world, for all the individuals, unless we put it allow competition and think competition positive thing. Just an example, many of our students in Europe think
Okay, seems like
that competition is just very good at sports, nice. But if it comes to the individuals at universities or for so we have to also rethink about that and to us.
One of the questions that sort of came to my mind, especially as Paul was describing this whole phenomena as a crowd phenomena, comparable to, let's say, the early years of communism, or the events in not so much Germany after in the early 40s, but perhaps in the late 20s, early 30s of the last century. So for a moment, if we sort of leave aside the question of India in the long run, suppose we think about just the next year or two, right? And so from what Paul says, it seems that presenting facts about was the government able to build? They said they're going to do a lockdown because they want to build capacity, right? So presenting facts about whether the capacity was built or not, or thinking about questions like how many lives do you sacrifice every life saved with the lockdown, where you have to think about lives lost because people have been pushed into poverty, which they would not have been pushed into otherwise. So from what you say, Paul, none of these arguments are really going to work. It's a sort of, so what might work in the next year or two? How do we kind of push back?
I think on that, the first thing to say is that arguments almost never have much effect. That is just true. I see in that sense, the relationship between people and the rise of sort of large groups and states and corporations much more in an evolutionary sense. And in our world, whatever one person thinks or does has hardly any effect. One has to see these more as sort of, all kinds of accidental and long run movements and sort of large group playing off against each other. Really, rationality has very little effect, and hardly anybody pays any attention to it. I also want to say a second thing, which is, I think, a problem with Indian economists in general, which is that they planning has had much effect, and that the Indian growth of the last 30 years is because of them. It's because they in Delhi planned this. I think all that is hubris. It's bullshit. It's just it's ego sense. But that's not how it's gone. Indian economic growth is sort of, despite all these little groups pretending that they are controlling things, it is due to this bloody competition between very greedy, not well-meaning, all kinds of local elites who are just afraid of the other elites and sort of want their region to grow, usually their own family and their own businesses, and rewriting legislation to help that and shielding them from the other people trying to steal from them by meaning the other politicians, right? That is the dynamic in India, and it's got very little to do with rational thought or economist planning. And so all these people who write their little macro models based on 1930s UK published models, and they say, oh, I could say something clever about that too. I mean, that's more like wastage, So if we come back to what can you do realistically, I think if business gets organized and pushes against it, that helps. But I think that the real hope for India is a return of political competition, right? Whereby enough people get disenchanted by what's happened that, as it were, little greedy groups and more savvy local groups are basically going to break away from this national consensus. That's your best hope.
Perhaps to Barbara, Paul, and also Bhuvana, about media. So when we talk about freedom and the libertarians, classical liberals, we all think of sort of the media as, if not the watchdog of democracy, at least playing a very active role in bringing out information and challenging government positions. And we like, Paul, you sort of mentioned the word competition a fair number of times, right? So we like the fact that a bunch of different media houses competing with each other. But, Bhuvana, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as at least the Indian media is concerned, I've looked a little bit at the US media. They're not very different. Fox News is a little bit different, but they have a reputation for other reasons as well. But, but as far as the Indian media goes, very little sort of difference of opinion in terms of government responses to COVID. There's a fair amount of agreement both between the nationalists, the sort of more left-oriented media. There isn't much of a difference in opinion. We've also seen some of the big sort of information houses, not media houses, information houses, Twitter and Facebook. They're willing to tag things as COVID misinformation. and get content out, labeling it as, misinformation, saying things like, let's say, infants are pretty much, not infants, but, children below 12 are pretty much immune to. Of course, one means it casually, but as far as the scientific studies go, Nature has an article this last month. The death rate in UK for people below the age of 40 is less than 1 in 10,000. There's no lower bound, but less than 1 in 10,000. It gets serious only for people above 80, where it's still less than 1 in 100. And that's for people above 80. So, what's happening with media and these information houses? What's happening there?
Barbara, would you like to react first?
Well, happy to react. The situation in Europe is different in each and every country, given how the media are financed, and I think this is the key problem. Whether you have state-financed media or state-supported media, or whether you have truly independent media that is financed from the private sector, and who are competing with other outlets. So it would be I would not dare now to say the one size fits all thing, because in each and every European country we have different issues and problems. But what is definitely true is that, of course, there has been a very strong influence on the media in the past by politics, in terms of kind of warning individuals of the consequences of COVID, and what will happen if individuals don't stick to the respective rules that are being set up by the governments. So this is a role that obviously our European media chose to play. And again, I don't dare to judge on that. It's just a fact that we should present and keep in mind. And as long as the system of media is what it is these days in Europe, it will be very difficult, and we will have to be very creative to also allow other voices that show different information, different channels of studies to the public. And I think it's up to the creativity of the next generation also to work on that. So this was, I think, very diplomatic, but I think you can read between the lines.
Paul, you have your hand up. You want to?
I think the media is a very interesting thing to sort of look at. And I agree with Barbara that the COVID reactions has depended a little bit on the diversity of media. So for instance, in Australia, News Corporation is actually running, sort of these anti-lockdown lines. And you don't see that in Britain, you don't see that in the Netherlands, you don't see that in much of mainland Europe, where nearly all the media has the same voice. But I think that journalists and journalism's role has changed a lot in the last 50 years. Right? We used to think of journalists as somewhat aristocratic people who are very smart, who sort of take their own advice, who investigate, who sort of feel that they could have their own opinion and then sort of try to tell this to the population. Again, this kind of individual entrepreneurialism. That's not what journalism or journalists are like now, almost anywhere in the West. Essentially, they've been paying much less than they used to. So we just don't get good people in journalism. And that's because the advertising revenue has sort of dropped to the bottom. News corporations find it very difficult to corner the advertising dollars which their media generates. And so by and large, journalists are not very smart. And so what they do, they follow the crowd. They go for easy stuff. They don't investigate. They do the easy stuff, which is they ask somebody, what do you think? And then they find somebody else who disagrees and they let them talk to each other. But that's not journalism. That's sort of, reducing everything to a simple fact because it's cheap. It's easy. You pretend to then inform people and have a debate, but it's not real journalism at all. And so to a certain extent, there is no journalism like it used to be. And the question of the future of media is probably more the question as well, are we going to get some billionaires to fund real media, which is then philanthropic? Is it going to be supplanted by sort of civic society media? The current media is just an incredibly low quality. And that will be, I don't know whether that's true in India, probably, maybe, but it's definitely true in the West, is that journalism has been so poorly paid that very, very little of the media is now high quality.
But Paul, why wouldn't this poorly paid people
Vipin,
represent?
may I add, please?
Yeah.
So the Indian experience is quite interesting, right? Is that we largely have only privately funded media, and it's been a disaster. I don't think this is, and for two, three different reasons. One is, of course, the fact that politics looms so large on all kinds of private funding or private initiative, right? So even where you have, large wealth houses really running media, they're also beholden to the government because the state controls everything else they do. And so there is no room for them to even exercise what would have happened, with your Catherine Grahams in the past, right? So that doesn't exist anymore in that sense. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is much like Paul says. So it's not journalism anymore. We're largely doing opinion, right? And if you think about it, the old newspaper, the central 2 pages would be opinion. But the entire newspaper or the entire media sort of package is now opinion, not news. But I do think that this is where the story of civil society becomes interesting. And I suspect that this is the area of the biggest disruption. So yes, for the longest period, it's all been rubbish. But I do see that things are changing. And I think there is a little bit, yes, at the margins at the moment, but I do see that technological disruption is helping with that. Because of 2 things. One, it is allowing people different places to go stick their sort of opinion in, right? So sort of taking that away from it potentially. But the second is for also us to reflect and say, what role are we playing in all of this? And I think the biggest role as civil society participants you can play is to say that I will pay subscriptions, right? And that I will do my bit to reward good information, to reward sort of old school journalism where it is about investigating the facts and getting 3 sources and, sort of being adamant about principle and so on and so forth, right? And I don't think that this is a supply side problem entirely, right? That there is a huge role for customers and consumers, for discerning customers and consumers to play. It'll probably take another 5-7 years for for it to snowball into something. But my sense is that there is a lot of room for it. In the case of India, at least written media in sort of or broadsheet media, I think has done slightly better than broadcast media, and this gives me a little bit of sort of hope, right? That there is a way to translate broadsheet media into technology that is not as ugly as broadcast media.
Let me add just one sentence because I think this summarizes what you just mentioned. There is a reason why Hayek said individuals think and act, and governments as such don't. It's the individual who makes the decisions, and because the individuals knows what is best for him and for her. So I think we should always keep that in mind when we discuss civil society as well.
While there's something to what Paul and Bhuvana said, I'm not quite sure. It's sort of, I don't find that their answers are very convincing. You see, so you could have very low quality journalism, which actually gives a fairly different opinions, but of all of very low quality. So you could have very low quality libertarian journalism, very low quality classical. You could make very poor arguments as to why government should not engage in any kind of policy, right? That doesn't really tell me why the low quality is of one particular kind.
You're right. I don't have a good enough diagnosis for it. The only thing that I can think about, at least in the case of India, is that because politics is looming so large, there is such an emphasis switching it in one direction, right? So if you think about pre-2014, it was the exact opposite. So your media was tremendously left biased historically in India. And that's because, sort of the same, that's where your bills came from. And that the government also happened to be one of the largest advertisers in broadsheet media, or for that matter, even in broadcast media. So there is something with that business model that there is an element of something that's broken, but I don't have a good answer for why it would be one type of argument that reigns over another.
Yeah, Vipin, I think you pose a good question, and it's true that, of course, low quality doesn't mean it's all the same argument. But my explanation for that has to do with the increased interconnectivity of lots of people, social media that sort of allows lots of people access to each other. And also the sort of the increased degree to which everybody feels they're constantly being observed by an anonymous crowd, right? We're constantly observed via Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, but also lots of people now have cameras, you know, cities are full of cameras, our friends sort of, you know, make camera things out of us. So we feel on display much more than we used to. The discretion has gone down. Now, I think what that means in terms of a force in our society is more and more conformism, right? I think that this has made it harder to think differently, just because you get lots of impulses and it's hard to separate oneself from that as an individual. But also there's just this group pressure. You know, you have to agree, otherwise you're out of the group. You have to agree. And so that you know, in the long run, that makes for much larger crowds. And crowds are scary things. Crowds really are scary things, because in a crowd state, which is like a group on steroids, millions of people get a focus on something very, very small, and to that they're willing to sacrifice awful amounts, but that can go in all kinds of crazy directions. I mean, the Nazis were not the only crowd in this world who sort of veered off. You know, you can also look at Islamic State in Syria, which was another such crowd, you know, tremendous energy and sort of innovation that came from that, but also tremendous destruction and to no good whatsoever, right? And I fear in that sense, if you look at what's coming for the next couple of dozens of years, I fear we're going to see more of these crowd phenomena, right? And crowd phenomena are nasty things. They are not nice things. This is not, you know, rational people moving towards the betterment of their society. That's not how crowds are. That's not what humans are. Humans also like a bit of destruction. They sort of revel in that, you know. It's the nastier side of humanity comes out in crowds. And so I'm not too optimistic on that score. The medium term, you know, is maybe crowd dominated.
So long term looks good. Medium doesn't look so good.
May I just add, because I'm slowly losing the connection here, and if I'm gone, please apologies, and I wish the conversation a very good, productive end, put it this way. But I think what is most important as libertarians and pro-market people, we have a couple of rules that we have always kept in mind. The achievement principle we have already discussed, competition as a mind, not only as a mindset, but what is important to create growth and well-being and also innovation. And the last thing is individual responsibility. So if we stick to those cornerstones and think that those are valuable for our societies, I think we will not be doomed. And as a libertarian, I think we should always think positive and believe in creativity and also in new processes. And having said that, we have to be positive about the future. Even if we have to take 2 or 3 steps back by now, or even those steps are not taken back by us as individuals, but by governments. But in the long run, I think those values that we just described and have been discussing all the time are the ones who will push forward society and will create better livings for everybody.
So can I react to that, Barbara? Is that I myself am not a libertarian, but I do recognize some good aspects of libertarianism, which I fully agree with. And if I think of one good role that libertarians have played in the last few centuries, is that they're pro-diffusion of power. That is the best thing they bring, right? And even if that comes with, sort of hero worshipping of people who are independently rich, I'll take it. Because, because diffusion of power comes with tremendously good things. Unfettered centralized power is a scary thing in this world. So, and this is very much a moment in time in which we need more diffusion of power, right? It's too centralized at the moment. It's not good. And I agree, we need the positivity and the, yes, more diffusion.
I have to hand over the sort of responsibilities to one of the SFL students, because there'll be people in the audience who are going to ask questions. But let me sort of ask one last question to our three panelists. It's a hypothetical question. So suppose the COVID were to go away. So we wake up tomorrow and the COVID virus is gone. And we also know that it's never going to appear again. Other pandemics could appear, but this virus is gone forever. Do you think that how long would it take for us, here in India and Europe, United States, the world more generally, to get back to how things were before COVID? Is here, for instance, right now, at least in the city I live in, we've got police checkposts at various points. The policeman would stop you and not ask you, but shout at you as to where you're going and where you came from. Then we need permits to go from one state to the other, one district to the other. Playgrounds are closed. Gyms are open, just recently opened, but you're not allowed to run your air conditioning there. Beaches are closed, no swimming and all the rest of that. So how long do you think it would take? And not just these specific examples, I mean more generally in terms of how people think of the state. How long would it take for us to go back to how things were before?
Can I quickly jump on that? I think it was very interesting what we saw after September 11th. Yeah. All those regulations and all those rules that have been put up for our own safety at airports, etc., are still in place and have been extended to a certain extent that we definitely as individuals don't like to travel anymore in the way that we have done. So I think the negative thing about this is that once we adapt to those rules and regulations, instead of say, hey, no, we don't need it. The good old thing is with laws or with regulations, we say one new in and two old ones out, but we never do that. And this should actually be done. And I think we should keep that in mind, that maybe for the first time we have an opportunity after COVID that we say, okay, let's have a clear look at what we have overregulated and overdone in the last decades or two, and just change things again and try to kick out old things that are not necessary anymore. So I hope to be positive, we can do that, but given reality and what has happened in the past 20 years, I'm not so positive about it.
Let me again react to Barbara and say that I, in general, agree with her, but I will also say most regulation is actually there because corporations wanted it and lobbied for it.
Yes.
Regulation is not inflicted on private business. Private business begs for it in order to compete with other private business users. But let me answer Vipin's question. I think much of Europe will be back pretty quickly within a couple of years because the state will have less money and will have been seen to fail. And so, and also because the hope for the economic recovery doesn't come from the state, but from the non-state, because the state has so conspicuously fucked up the economy. So I basically think within 2 to 3 years, we'll be roughly back to the same employment levels as before. And also all the joy in life that we've now killed off collectively will come back because people like to be joyous. They like to be happy. And so they like to see others, hug others, kiss others, etc. I think all that will be gone fairly soon in Europe. I can't speak about India. I think in India, because the power game is not yet settled in India, the state will try and hang on. But I think power competition in India is usually won. And Indira Gandhi is a great example. She tried to centralize power in India and basically lost out, eventually being murdered. And I think similarly now the Modi government is over-grasping power. It will not be able to hang on to it. It might try, but it won't be able to. India's too diverse to do it.
Let's hope so. Bhuvana, Europe 2 years, maybe 3, people hugging each other in two years before we hug each other in Europe. How
I've never stopped hugging. I've always thought this is totally.
Now this video is going to be taken out as misinformation, Paul. Look at what you've done. This is it. And, you'll also get calls from Fox News to appear there. That's the only place it will take you now. But otherwise, you're gone, Paul. But Bhuvana, how long in India before, you can drive from one place to the other without getting harassed on your way?
Pretty soon, but I don't think that's the right question, right? So in some areas, I see the return to normal happening quickly, partly because of desperation, because we're desperately poor and people need to get employed and start earning money, right? So it's just inevitable in that sense. But I think in other areas, I worry, and I think that some of the sort of build up will extend and last. So, for example, particularly in areas related to health and sanitation. So, for example, phytosanitary measures, for example, drugs regulation, for example, hospital and allied regulation, for example, food and food safety, and travel. I also see that there is an element of, sort of deep racism that we should brace ourselves for. We're already seeing it starting with, world ganging up against China in a way and things like that, right? So there is an element of that worries me a lot. So I don't see the return to normal being very sort of pleasant on some counts. Our Prime Minister said something very interesting a few days back. He said, can you imagine that a state would have been able to do a lockdown pre-2014? He was very proud of it. That scared the hell out of me, right? Because there is an implicit message there, and there is sort of something for all of us to worry about. And I suspect that the confidence of having imposed a lockdown also emboldens you towards can embolden you towards terrible things. So that worries me a lot.
Right. So thank you very much, Barbara, Bhuvana, and Paul, for this, enjoyable discussion. I think some of what you said speaks a lot of what you said speaks not just to COVID, but the dynamics of regulation more generally, which is sort of what Paul wanted to do. He wanted us to talk about COVID and using COVID speak about more general principles, right, Paul, so that we don't get lost in sort of the gymnastics of words, right? So I'll hand it over to the SFL organizers. Thank you, SFL, once again for having us. And I think there are questions from the students who've been listening in. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Dr. Vipin. Thanks a lot. So now I'd like to invite Ms. Suganti Bhavi to take over this session. Ms. Suganti is a former Students for Liberty member, and currently she's working as a translator at a Latin American-based publication named Pan Am Post, and she's based out of Mumbai. So I hand over the stage to Ms. Suganti.
Thank you to the panel. I am going to get to the Q&A, but I just want to take everyone's minute to talk about what is happening in Belarus. Belarus is often considered the last dictatorship of Europe, and after calling for free and fair elections, civilians protesting there over the last few weeks have been met with extreme violence by the state authorities, and the police brutality has resulted in over 6,700 detentions. Students for Liberty is extremely concerned about the recent developments in Belarus, and we have a virtual protest happening tomorrow, the details for which will be linked in the description of wherever you're watching this stream right now. Okay, I am getting to the Q&A.
Good luck for that. With dictators.
Okay, so the first question actually is for Bhuvana. How can libertarian values be integrated into the Indian Constitution, which has socialist in its preamble?
I think there's the answer right there, no? In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there is a petition that is in the queue at the moment in front of the courts saying that you want to, sort of redact secular and socialist from the Constitution's preamble. That being said, I don't call myself a libertarian. I think myself in the classical liberal mode. But within that, Barbara reminded us of those fundamental values, right? Individual responsibility, competition, achievement, a sense of achievement, these kinds of things, right? So how do you think of embedding them in the Constitution? That's a very big sort of hard question to answer. Some of our friends, in fact, Vipin and my friends, I think, have argued for a wholesale rewrite of the constitution. I am a traditionalist. I would much rather do it through the constitutional process, which means that we will never get to that, full view. But I do think that there are some immediate things that you can do, particularly the schedules attached to our constitution, which took away power from the states, which have enormously expanded the role of the central government, and which have not given a role for sort of the lowest level of government, particularly urban government in the constitution. These are sort of three things that I think, at least from sort of immediate relief to people point of view, I think they could go a long distance.
Thank you, Bhuvana. The next question is from Irfan Ibrahim, and it's not addressed to any specific panelists. I'll open it to everyone. If central planning is too complex and may limit personal preferences, what do you think of the concept of a national budget? It's open to everyone. Yeah, this is the question.
Vipin, why don't you take that?
I think Vipin had to go somewhere. I'm not sure if he's on the panel right now. Yeah, Vipin is not on the panel right now. So over to you, Bhuvana.
Paul, would you like to?
Well, I mean, we already have a national budget, so I wasn't clear about what the question was. Most countries have national budgets. So what was the question about?
I believe that what he's asking is that, actually, I'm not sure. Okay, I'll read it out anyway, and if anyone wants to take it. If central planning is too complex and may limit personal preferences, how will the concept of a national budget be looked on? Yeah.
Well, but I mean, this goes to the point of what our societies actually are. I mean, all countries are now mixed economies, right? There is a large element to which there is authority of the state and also a large element of private enterprise, at least power outside of state structures, even if it's in forms of corporations or small businesses. And the world just sees different combinations of that, but it's a sliding scale, and it is almost surprising how small the differences are. I mean, the American government is no less large than that of many in Europe. It just spends the money in slightly different ways. Welfare is called slightly different things, but really it's not all that different. And of course, the state is not a monolith. It's not true that there ever was a central planning unit which did the whole economy. I mean, only the Soviets tried that for a while, and look where that got them. So to a certain extent, central planning in the way envisaged doesn't exist. And national budgets are more like that, national budgets whereby they sort of decide on the allocation of national taxation a little bit. But even that, most national budgets are sort of pretense jobs, right? They pretend to have a control which they don't in reality have. So, yeah, we're going to have national budgets for reasons of theater, if nothing else.
We have a question from Rishi. I believe this was addressed for Barbara, but if anyone else wants to take it, what are the principles of conscious capitalism, and is conscious capitalism sustainable?
Well, again, these are kind of God view type questions, as if we can sort of choose to be these things or not. And also a notion of that there is such a thing as, well, we choose to be capitalist. I mean, we're not. We're on an evolutionary trajectory where almost every country in the world now is a little bit capitalist, a little bit statist, a lot of new regulation, which is pushed by the private sector, not inflicted on it, but begged for it. And hence it's much more a question of degrees. And there's no choice in this. The notion that we can sort of say, oh yeah, we need to go to conscious capitalism. It's like, it's like we're choosing not to have rain tomorrow. It's like, it's not in the choice set, these kind of things.
Okay, another question, but we have quite a few questions about China, but
I'd like to start at that question if possible. A little bit overlapping with Paul, but also slightly taking it forward. we have very limited ways of being able to change a system, right? The most that you can do is change your action, right? So if you start an enterprise, if you are a consumer, if you are an employee, there are things that you can do that are within your sphere of control. And my sense is that there is a lot that can be done even within that sphere of control. And it's true, it may not feel like the world is changing, but surely if everyone does it well enough, that there is a way for all of this to snowball. And one thought that occurs to me is more recently, you've had firms who've started this interesting concept of menstrual leave, right? A lot of firms have started on their own saying that we're going to give. And there's a huge amount of public debate on this. This is not the challenge, right? What you want to look at is to say that this is how you want labor market regulation competition to work, for firms to compete on different types of value propositions for their employees as well as for customers, right? That, to my mind, is conscious capitalism. The second all of the firms get together and say that, oh, we're going to lobby for it to be mandatory, I think we've taken a few steps too far. So just sort of rephrasing rather than saying, what will it take to make conscious capitalism, to say, what will it take for me to be a conscious capitalist, right? And that reframing may be helpful.
Yeah, but let me bounce that back. What is an unconscious capitalist? I mean, which firm does not already compete for workers in all kinds of ways?
Absolutely right.
It sets up a straw man, this sort of stuff. You know, it's just the next round of bullshit. I mean, you know, corporate social, it is just, you know, it's this kind of, let's put a new label on what we always used to do. But unless you ask the question, well, who's an unconscious capitalist? These things are meaningless.
I think the way the world set this up, if I'm not mistaken, is two or three things, right? One is in the treatment practices to employees and labor, about the sourcing of materials and the sort of environmental footprint. I think there were two or three of these things that have been what's the word? Stolen. Or
yes, but these are like catchphrases in order for somebody to get a job as, you know, a corporate social responsibility officer. I mean, this is competing for the bullshit space. I mean, and yeah, there's a lot of that. There are jobs in that, so I can see the point. But I mean, one should not fool oneself and think that this is a new movement that's going to change the world.
Touche.
Thank you. There are a few questions on China. I'm going to try to put them together. Will China become the global leader in trade, finance, economy, politics, technology, post-COVID-19, and dominate the world? How to counter that? There are questions on US-China trade war and also more recently the India-China trade boycott war.
Okay, now I've researched China for quite a number of years because I looked at the internal Chinese migration, sort of studied its systems and that. And I think there are several things which should be interesting to an Indian audience. I think first, China is the biggest trading partner in the world. They trade more than anybody else, and they will be the single most powerful political unit for the next 50 years or so, because they're just more cohesive, there's more of them, they will have a bigger GDP than the US, they already do, and they'll outgrow that. So China will be the individual biggest player, but it's also important to realize how weak the Chinese are. I mean, they only make up maybe 1/5, 1/6 of the world population. Nobody else speaks their language. They have a political system which is not conducive to making friends because they're so inward looking. And so they won't be stronger than the West combined. I don't think they will be able to inflict much damage on India. And so, yes, they'll be the single biggest player, but they'll be contained. And they won't be dominant in the world, not at all. They'll just be the single biggest one, but not bigger than the West as a bloc. And the second thing is that in my predictions, I think India will eventually outgrow China. It'll take 2 to 3 generations, but I think India will outgrow China because China has a handicap that India doesn't have. And China's handicap is collectivist politics. And collectivist politics tends to extremism and tends towards civil wars, which China have at a very regular basis. And the great advantage of India is its huge diversity. Yes, it's less well run. Yes, it's less well educated. It's got all these problems, but in the long run, its diversity and the fact that nobody can truly boss around everybody else is going to mean that its growth won't stop like it already sort of has in China. So I depict a better future for India than China, but I do think it will take 60 years.
Bhuvana, do you have something to add to that?
I don't know very much about China, so no.
Okay, the next question is, how do we reconcile the economy and the environment, where many people in India and China deserve to live in conditions like Americans do, but that seems impossible right now. So yeah, the question mainly is how to reconcile the economy and the environment.
Look, this is again a general interest question. Let me say the most important thing, which is nobody is going to stop the Chinese and the Indians from becoming just as consumerist as the Americans. So the notion that it can't happen or that it won't happen is just nonsense. It will happen. It'll just take some time for India to grow that far. China's already getting that far, but they all dream of cars. They all dream of more air conditioning, more travel, and nobody's going to stop them. I mean, who's going to make war with India to stop you becoming that rich? Nobody. So the fantasy that we're somehow not going to economically grow because the world can't afford it environmentally is just that. It's a fantasy. So it's going to happen, but then the question is, well, is this going to be terrible for the environment? No, I don't think so. I think that the same technology which we use to grow will also be increasingly directed to clean up, to improve the environment, to make the best of it. So I do think countries like India, which are still, on the downward slope towards the Kuznets curve, will first do a lot more damage to its own local environment, but it will, over time, direct more resources to improving it. And you see this in China. China's local environment is already improving. They're starting to clean up the rivers. They're starting to, have national parks. They're starting to really care about the panda. They are starting to care more about air quality. They're changing their industries. Now, India is not yet rich enough to do that, but it will become that rich. And then, things won't be so bad.
So I agree and disagree. I do think it will be a little bad. I am a nature lover, I'm an environmental lover, and I can see, sort of the sad state of affairs here, right? But I agree with Paul. I think it is inevitable. I think it is a fallacy that we're going to be able to do both well. In particular, I think what exacerbates that fallacy or exacerbates, sort of that tussle between the two is not letting the market do its job, right? So not letting the market create the scarcity that will then give you the signals that says start conserving or, change course, right? In particular, for example, coal-based power in the case of India, or for that matter, doing ridiculous, stupid things with China, like saying that we won't allow you to import solar batteries. We have to make in India. This is dumb, right? If you were to let the market do its job, you'd fast track some of that transition. I think fast tracking would be good for us. I don't think we'll be able to certainly match pace with, so the US or for that matter, China, because we do have to go far richer for these things to become more salient, for us to be, to pay the money that it will take to have a clean environment, right? So it is a 20-year game to my mind. But I do think that wherever we end up undercutting markets in the name of some of the other, sort of protectionist rationale, we are doing ourselves a great disservice and doing our environment a great disservice.
Thank you. Now, the next question was addressed for Vipin, but I will also throw it at Bhuvana now. Amrit Sharma says that the Indian economy is not growing as the economists had predicted a few years ago. What do you think the Indian government should focus on in the short term?
That's a really hard question. What should they focus on short term? So a few different things. One is, and COVID's given us a nice example of how to do this, right? What are the barriers to starting, engaging in an enterprise in India? And there are still plenty of them. in particular, sort of the way the state is in every different aspect of running an enterprise, and particularly in places where it doesn't need to be. So I'll give you an example. In Tamil Nadu, I think the Factories Act, Tamil Nadu is the state of India, the Factories Act has this really interesting provision in there that says that you must have a disposable bin for female hygiene, right? What does that even mean? Who's going to inspect? Who's going to figure out? Just sort of those kinds of things. And there are a dime a dozen. There are hundreds and thousands of these things that we need to get rid of. COVID has given us some bright lights. So I think about 4 or 6 states have already started reforming a lot of their labor regulations and embedding a certain amount of flexibility in them. I think this is a good idea. The center needs to get out of the way, and because otherwise states are not truly competing. So there's one thing that I have on my mind. There are, of course, several sort of others, particularly as it relates to what the state's priority should be. The rule of law in India is broken. We do need to reorient the machinery of the state towards doing the criminal justice system or doing contract enforcement. We fail abysmally at both. So as far as priorities go, of all the things that we do, I think this should be what we focus on the most, and automatically I think that the economic growth will fall. But there are no silver bullets, right? This is a long march to prosperity. It doesn't happen in 1 year and 2 years and 3 years.
Thank you. Now we are running over time, so I'm going to ask maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I think
This is
Paul
from
has something to say.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to agree with Bhuvana and add something, which is, yes, get out of the way of central government. But the second thing which struck me about India is that there are lots and lots of barriers to trade between the individual states of India. And that's an easy win, right? That's an easy win. That's got nothing to do with anybody outside of India. That's an easy win. And that's something that Delhi should get into, right? Just reduce these bloody trade barriers between the states.
Yes, we agree with you, Paul. Okay. This question is from Walter. It might be a slightly loaded question, but I'm going to leave this to the speakers. How do you balance delegating responsibility to tech giants that develop apps and gadgets that seek to reduce our independence, much similar to the state does? This was addressed for Barbara, but yes, go Paul.
I think in general, India is not yet in a position that it can dictate tech giants to do much, and should in fact try to undercut much of the West. That's probably in India's advantage. So I'd say in the short run, don't do much at all. I do think in the longer run, India will have the problem that lots of Europe now has, which is how to tax the tech giants and how to get control over them back, because of course they are threatening basically the government control over lots of markets, right? And governments will have to take back the intermediary role on the markets that tech giants are now having. But I think this is a problem for another day. I think right now in India, I'd say don't worry about it.
Bhuvana, do you have something to add? Okay, the next question is for Bhuvana. The question looks cut here. It's from Vastav Sharma. What is your view on the economy of Jammu and Kashmir after the application of Article 370? Well, yeah, the question is cut here. Will state PSUs be dissolved and industries stopped?
Sorry, I didn't catch the second question on PSUs.
Actually, no, the question is like cut here and where I'm looking at it. It's gone from here as well. Yeah, will state PSUs be dissolved and it's scrolling way too fast. Okay, yeah, but the main question was, what is your view on the economy of Jammu and Kashmir after 370? After what happened?
We do not have a view on the Jammu and Kashmir economy. It's far too complex for us to be able to whittle it down into, sort of this kind of.
Yeah, I agree. That could be a whole other entire session. I think that's it. We have covered all the questions. Well, there's one question for Paul. Why is it that many youngsters advocate for socialism despite its failure in countries like Russia, North Korea, and Venezuela? I'm not sure why it's addressed specifically for Paul, but yes.
I can answer that. I mean, socialism has two independent appeals, and they are appeals sometimes to the same people, sometimes to different people. One major appeal of socialism is that it pretends that humans can be something they're not, which is nice, which is only socially oriented. They can make a new human in which no one is greedy, in which you don't need competition, but we all cooperate with each other. Now, this is something that our religions tell us. This is something that we say inside our families. And so it is a natural fantasy to sort of want to extend this to the whole of the group. And that is the enduring appeal of socialism. It is the lie that we are nice, fluffy bunnies. And to extend that lie, beyond the groups where it's functional towards the group where it's not functional. And that will keep on going. The second thing, which is the appeal of socialism, is the appeal of total power, right? Many people, particularly students who like socialism, dream of the fact that they control the country, they control the world. And that fuels them no end. They love that power fantasy. So I often tell the joke of a British comedian who said that his parents were communists. They said they didn't disagree with capitalists having power. The only thing they disagreed with is that they thought socialists should have power, i.e. themselves. That's where I think it comes from. The enduring appeal of power and the lie that we're fluffy bunnies.
I absolutely agree with Paul. Just the name, right? I think the name is so much more appealing than capitalism is. Everybody wants to be social, right? And one way to think about it is that, unfortunately, I think the sad part of it is capitalism is probably a far more social system than socialism will ever be. Socialism is soul destroying. It is, destroys communities. It turns people against each other. But the name is just, it's great advertising.
Thank you, Una. Thank you, Paul. I think that's it for the Q&A. If someone from SFL can take over here.
Hi. Okay. So I'd like to present the vote of thanks. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers and the audience that has arrived here. I believe the discussion was a very fruitful and efficient discussion. Despite being on an online platform, we were able to do everything on time and be efficient. I'd like to start off by thanking our moderator, Dr. Vipin, who has now left. Thank you, Vipin, sir. I'd also like to thank Dr. Barbara Kolm, who's also left. Thank you, Barbara, ma'am. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Paul Frijters and Ms. Bhuvana. Thank you, sir and ma'am. And I'd like to thank our moderator, Ms. Sukanti. Thank you, Sukanti. And finally, I'd like to present our heartfelt thanks to the CPSLR NUALS, the Center for Parliamentary Studies and Law Reforms in the National University of Advanced Legal Studies, and the director of the center and my professor, Dr. Anil R. Nair. I'd also like to thank South Asia Students for Liberty. And once again, I thank everyone for participating in this meeting. Thank you.
Ashwin, may I just add something quickly?
Yes, ma'am.
My congratulations to SFL. Every time I come into one of these, they're just, how you manage to draw all these crowds and how you manage to keep going is really fantastic. I think South Asia Students for Liberty